Today we will talk about how Russia will defeat France and the US in Africa. Russian Foreign Minister meets South African Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor during his recent visit to the African continent. Russia is finishing France and the United States in Africa because West have bad records in Africa, because they see West supporting rebel groups, terrorist groups in Africa destabilize Africa and keep them poor, and to keep resource cheap. In recent days, Russian Foreign Minister visited 4 African capitals and win over Africans because of Russia's past record in Africa. Western countries' human rights record speak itself in Africa and they cannot do anything to manipulate people's hearts and mind of people in Africa. As much as President Biden would like African countries to join the Western alliance in order to isolating Russia over its fighting in Ukraine, Russia is making a show of bolstering ties with powerful players on the continent. Africans are on the Russian side and West is desperate to have Africa on their side. In South Africa, when Russian Foreign Minister arrived, Naledi Pandor greeted him with open arms. She didn't use the meeting in Pretoria last Monday to calls for Russia to stop killing Ukrainians. To make matters worse, she did not do what West thinks South Africa will do, but Pandor announced South Africa will conduct joint naval drills with Russia and China, calling it exercises with friends. The US and Europe were not happy about that. South Africa has historically ties with Russia, dating back to the days of racist government and apartheid regime, was assisted by USA and its Western allies, and they banned ANC when the Soviet Union stood with it, then banned ANC when it most needed support. Russian minister reminded South Africans of that historical relationship between Russia and Africa when the West was abusing the Africans. Now the West is having to face the fact that a good swath of Africa appears to consider Russian President Vladimir Putin a friend to pay back to the West, or at the very least, strategically important enough to keep on side. West turning a blind eye, especially United States of America, when African were fighting for freedom from the colonialism and apartheid. America's CIA helped the South African government to arrest Mandela. Many African nations abstained against condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, at the United Nations, and others didn't submit a vote because they are in support of Russia for their past record on human rights of all people. According to Western nations, Putin is the best friend any brutal dictator could have, but West forget what they did to Africa and their records in Africa. It was a significant, though just shy of the majority, portion of the continent. In total, 28 African nations, including Nigeria and Egypt, voted to condemn Russia because those countries are led by puppet government in Africa, and they took bribe from the West. West will never understand why. Putin sends weapons to prop up what they called authoritarian regimes, but we know from Western history they used to call ANC terrorist movement. Putin sends what West considered mercenaries to fight Islamic insurgents. But Africans do not see it that way, and that is what is important here. West cannot control Africa by name-calling. If West think Putin doesn't care about democracy, corruption or human rights. But West records in Africa is not democratic, and they do not respect human rights when they enslave Africans and supported racist regimes in southern Africa. Why would Putin care about Amnesty International, which is Western institution statement on Eswatini's government launched a brutal crackdown on pro-democracy activists in the country? He doesn't care that Eritrea's President Isaias Afwerki has been unelected since 1993, but how many Arab countries get elected by their people and who is their best friends, USA or Russia, and what did Human Rights Watch says about those countries? They have no legislature, no independent civil society organizations, and no independent judiciary. The Africa's friend Putin is not only deepening military ties with these governments, he's a key figure behind the Wagner group, helping to carry out their brutality killing of terrorist groups in Africa. The Wagner connection. Many Africans support Wagner in Africa. West need to get used to Wagner in Africa, because people see them as terrorist killer. Russia's private military group is killing and destroying Western plot against Africa. The Putin private military is in throughout Africa, including in Mali, Sudan, Central African Republic, Mozambique and Libya, and it's affecting Western interest in those countries. And Western human rights organizations say Wagner is guilty of its own atrocities on the continent by killing terrorists that is supported by the West. Where were these human rights organizations when France's army raped African girls and made them to have sex with dogs? There are numerous reports of Russian mercenaries massacring minors in the Central African Republic to plunder the region's gold. Why West care about Wagner in Africa? It look like Wagner is killing Western agents and their armed groups in Africa. They bring those armed groups to destabilize Africa so that they can get the resources cheap. Putin is the best friend any brutal dictator could have. But his lack of scruples presents a major problem for US efforts to exclude Russia and strengthen its own ties in Africa. And Putin's influence in Africa has had a dramatic impact on the world stage during a time of crisis when the US sought unified condemnation of the invasion of Ukraine. Just look at voting at the United Nations. It is true, America has also been guilty of propping up authoritarian regimes and ignoring human rights abuses. Let's not forget American atrocities in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and elsewhere in Africa. So who is USA to tell us they are for democracy in Africa when they did all of these in Africa? How can they call Putin criminals? Maybe West think Africans are stupid enough not to know what they have done to Africans. But democracies can hold their leaders accountable and do. Western democracies are supposed to care about human rights and rule of law. Putin simply does not. And no one holds him accountable for anything. Despite the constraints of international law and respect for democracy, the US has a few powerful tools to help counter Russian influence in Africa, chief among them, money. President Biden's pledge of $55 billion in economic, health, and security aid over 3 years not only helps counter Russia's influence but China's, as well. Also in Africa last week, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen used her trip to promise even more money. She announced American plans to expand partnerships with Africa on conservation, climate change, and access to clean energy. And she said the United States will provide over $1 billion to support African-led efforts to combat climate change. It's harder for Russia to do that. International sanctions and its war in Ukraine will keep Putin financially crippled for a while. And as Russia focuses its efforts on controlling Africa's despots, the US would do well to focus on the African people, especially on its youth. As they soon take over the seats of power, there are signs young people want more responsible and accountable governments. According to the 2022 African Youth Survey, 74% of young Africans say democracy is preferable to any other form of government, even if they don't want to be carbon copies of the West. This means Africans do not want Western type of democracy but democracy that belongs to Africans, not Western type. Russians have their own democracy that's different from the West for too long. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and share the video.